American Oligarchy, 5 Fights, Part 1. It's always darkest just before it goes totally pitch black. We're daily buffeted by bad news designed to scare and demoralize us. But what if that backfires? What if we don't cave? What if this current crisis is the only thing that could put us on the right path to a prosperous and equitable future? We are moved to amend. Grassroots citizens dedicated to passing a 28th Amendment to overturn Citizens United, the disastrous 2010 Supreme Court decision that made the Trump coup possible because it enshrined that corporations are people and money is speech. Before the Trump takeover, a 28th Amendment was a long-term goal, but now it's our only hope. We've done this 27 times in our history, the first 10 times being the Bill of Rights. In fact, we the people have beaten corporate attempts to take over America 5 separate times. Now we're in round 6, a real democracy crisis. The Chinese word for crisis is made up of 2 symbols, danger and opportunity. Clearly, we're at an inflection point. Something has to change. The good news is that big shocks can lead to rapid and positive change. But here's the danger part. It can also lead to fascism. The oligarchs can win, and indeed they are advancing all over the world. Think of Putin, Orban, Bukele, and others. Our present crisis is the product of systemic degradation that's been going on for decades. We can trace this degradation back to at least the 60s, when, remember, we had similar upheaval and polarization. We'll explore this in depth in the next episode, but briefly, future Supreme Court Justice Powell wrote a secret memo to protect corporations from 60s cultural critique and democratic accountability. This strategy merged with the Republican program for permanent minority rule, which they are close to achieving, thanks in no small part to the tsunami of dark money unleashed by that 2010 Citizens United ruling that established money is speech and corporations are people. So this gives us a big clue about what the root cause of our crisis is, namely corporate constitutional rights. But to understand the real story, we have to go all the way back to the founding of our democratic experiment, which will also give us some clues about how to move beyond our current crisis. This history will show that our democracy, as mentioned, has been threatened by corporate oligarchy 5 times, and we the people organized and prevailed. We can and must do that again now. Round 1. 1776 was our first fight with oligarchy. A fact that gets conveniently left out of the American history books is that America actually began with an act of massive, nonviolent, anti-corporate civil disobedience, the Boston Tea Party. Some quick background. In 1580, Sir Francis Drake sailed home to England with a rich cargo of spices and captured Spanish treasure. His main investor, Queen Elizabeth's half share of the cargo, surpassed the rest of her income for that entire year, a 5,000% return on her investment. So profitable was this piracy, they decided to scale it up. So they got more aristocratic investors and started the first modern corporation, the East India Company, in 1600. This allowed Elizabeth to do colonization on the cheap, via privatization. She empowered the East India Company to use any means, including raising a private army, to conquer lands and extract wealth. Years later, they botched the job so badly that the British government took over India, the Raj. However, before that, the East India Company was defeated militarily by its rival Dutch West India Company and went heavily into debt. But its investors, remember, the English aristocracy, saved it by granting it an exclusive monopoly to sell its only asset, a huge cache of tea to the American colonies. Anybody else besides the East India Company who imported tea was declared a smuggler. Kind of like now if you refuse to buy a Tesla, you're a terrorist. In the Boston Tea Party, enough for 1 million cups of tea was dumped into the harbor in protest, which the company said was worth $1,700,000 in today's money. When Boston patriots refused to pay for the tea, the Royal Navy enforced an economic blockade of the harbor. The rest you know. The colonists went to win the Revolutionary War and our freedom. The East India Company went on to be the biggest drug trafficker in history, producing the Opium Wars. The score at the end of the first round: corporate oligarchy 0, America 1. Now you might be wondering, given this history, if corporations are so important and dangerous, why aren't they in the Constitution? Fair question. But it's because the founders wanted to keep them a state matter so that local people could keep an eye on them. In addition, they were originally rare and limited, only getting a single task that the government couldn't easily do, like dig a canal. Moreover, they had a strict time limit, usually 10 years, and their charter could be revoked at any time for any reason, including just not doing a good job. This will change, as we will see. But you know what else isn't in the Constitution? The Supreme Court getting to decide what's constitutional. How did that happen? In 1800, after the conservative Federalist President John Adams lost to the more liberal Thomas Jefferson, he packed the court with hyper-partisan judges. On taking office, Jefferson found Adams' undelivered stack of judicial appointments and ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, to lose them. Based on the ensuing court case, Justice Marshall grabbed the right to overturn a law passed overwhelmingly by Congress and signed by President Washington himself. Not too many years later, the state of New Hampshire thought it would be a good idea if Dartmouth College was a secular state school, not a religious institution, and amended its charter accordingly. However, the Supreme Court stopped this, ruling that a corporation is an artificial, immortal being, and that New Hampshire had violated a contract. We will see this is the first of many times that the Supreme Court rules for property rights over people rights. We will also see that the Supreme Court will increase corporate constitutional rights while whittling away those of actual citizens. After that Dartmouth case, the Supreme Court, deciding what's lawful and constitutional, lay dormant for quite a while, until Justice Roger Taney tried and failed to deal with the slavery question in the much-reviled 1857 Dred Scott decision. The court ruled that because the slave Scott was considered private property of his owners, he was subject to the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, prohibiting the taking of property without due process. That Supreme Court decision has been widely denounced, both for its overt racism and for its crucial role in the start of the American Civil War 4 years later. Part 2. This Dred Scott Supreme Court failure brings us to Oligarchy versus America, Round 2, the Civil War. Slavery was seen as a negative even by many of the founders who held slaves, and most thought it would fade soon. But the cotton gin came along, which did the work of 50 people. So suddenly a slave like Dred Scott, who had been selling for $250, was suddenly worth $1,200. The Southern oligarchs did not merely want to secede and keep slavery in the southern part of the country. They actually wanted to make slavery the law of the land. Tom Hartman explains that there's basically a 5-step process for oligarchs to take over America, and we see a number of them in a speech by Illinois Representative Farnsworth in 1864. He noted that they tried to expel John Quincy Adams, got control of all three branches of government, of churches, of the high society, and then suppressed the right to petition, freedom of the press, and the mail. The Dred Scott decision, as well as the Southern oligarchs' sedition, was essentially overturned by the Civil War, at the cost of 600,000 casualties, but it led to the 13th through 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment is going to become really important here going forward, because it's been captured by corporations in order to get constitutional rights on top of their already powerful economic and legal capabilities, which gives them political power through legalized bribery. A recent example: billionaire tech lord Elon Musk basically buys the presidency. Then another set of oligarchs arose in the gilded, not golden, age of the corporate robber barons, a time like our own, when enormous wealth was concentrated. Rockefeller, Carnegie, and the like used their economic, legal, and political power to destroy or buy out their competition. And they tried to consolidate their power to the maximum by winning corporate constitutional rights. They were opposed by the populist Grange, that's the farmers, and the more urban labor movement, as well as the progressive movement. The progressives put safeguards in place so that they could beat the robber baron oligarchs if they captured the political system, as in fact they did, notably the Southern Pacific Railroad in California and the Copper Kings in Montana, and this will become important later on as well. At the same time, in the 1880s, Rockefeller's Standard Oil monopoly was threatened by an Ohio law, so it fled to New Jersey. This started what is called chartermongering, states making it easier and easier with fewer and fewer restrictions to have a corporation, which starts a kind of race to the bottom. That trend has continued, but the corporate oligarchs' biggest and most consequential victory in this time period took place on the opposite coast, in the form of the 1886 Southern Pacific Railroad versus Santa Clara County court case. The Southern Pacific, which got big subsidies to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and then tried to get out of repaying the loans by buying a Senate seat, controlled transportation in California and thus the economic and political system. To lock in their power, they kept trying to get corporate constitutional rights by sneaking it into every trivial and unrelated lawsuit, such as this Santa Clara case regarding, incredibly, 3 hogs that were run over, and a later case regarding property taxes on their fences. So badly did they want to win, they hired Senator Roscoe Conklin, who had turned down an appointment to be on the Supreme Court twice because it didn't pay enough. He in fact made quite a good living as a consultant in railroad legal cases because he was on the committee of, there it is again, the 14th Amendment, remember, which overcame Dred Scott by enshrining in the Constitution, the highest law in our land, that freed slaves have equal protection under the law. Sadly, it's rarely been used to protect African Americans, but has been used well over 200 times to protect corporations. So Conklin would wave around his journal and claim that it proved the committee intended to include artificial persons, that is, corporations. Remember, like Dartmouth? Not just natural persons with belly buttons. J.C. Bancroft Davis, former railroad president, wrote up the 1886 fence decision at the direction of Associate Justice Stevens J. Field, who was a pal of Leland Stanford, president of the Southern Pacific Railroad and, not coincidentally, governor of California. Field desperately wanted to be president of the United States, and he needed the railroads to back him. Thus he was upset in this fence property case that Bancroft Davis did not clearly establish corporate personhood. Bancroft merely dropped a few lines into the head note, which actually has no legal standing. He stated that the justices all agreed that corporations are in fact people, and thus entitled to constitutional protection like citizens. And that's how it happened. But all this flew under the radar for quite a while, and the progressives did rack up some important wins against corporate monopoly and the robber barons. For example, the ability to recall a governor and to write laws by proposition. We get Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, who went after the monopolies, and in 1907, the Tillman Act made it a felony for a corporation to give money to a federal campaign. There was a large fine, 2 years in jail, and it could lose its charter, essentially a corporate death sentence. But never fear. Corporations can always depend on the Supreme Court, which did its best to roll back those progressive-era gains. This time is often called the Lochner era, a term you might have heard recently in terms of the new Trump supermajority on the Supreme Court. In the Lochner era, the Supreme Court conservatives knocked down even the most benign progressive laws in the name of property and contracts, for example, child labor, or limiting the hours in the workday. So again, we see property being privileged over people. This originalist Supreme Court also blocked President Roosevelt's New Deal, ruling bills unconstitutional despite the fact that they had passed Congress overwhelmingly. Part 3. But at the same time, a bigger threat was brewing, which brings us to round 3 in our oligarchy versus America fights. Remember that a crisis can lead to an important reform or fascism. The New Deal was fought not only by the Supreme Court, but also by corporations, especially the National Association of Manufacturers, DuPont and Rockefeller. Aligned with them was the Liberty League, and a lot of that America First nonsense that comes up with Reagan and later with Trump has its roots here. These corporations also supported the 1933 fascist business coup. This involved General Smedley Butler, a retired Marine Corps general twice awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He regretfully called himself a gangster for capitalism because he had fought unions and democracy, particularly in banana republics, as well as for Standard Oil in China. He was approached by businessman Gerald McGuire to arm veterans like the American Legion to storm and take the Capitol, probably because in 1932 Butler had been a big supporter of the Bonus Army, which had a very disciplined and peaceful protest encampment at the Capitol, busted up by the Army with tanks, gas, and bayonets. They were merely asking for money promised to them for their World War I service to be paid a few years early to get their families through the Great Depression. General Butler blew the whistle on this coup, and when McGuire was questioned by the House Un-American Activities Committee, it proved that this coup could have happened. The Liberty League's principal players were wealthy Americans and corporations, including the aforementioned DuPonts, J.P. Morgan, U.S. Steel, General Motors, Standard Oil, Chase National Bank, and Goodyear Tire. In fact, General Motors, IBM, and Texaco did business with the Nazis. After the coup was exposed, the congressional hearings about it were minimized by the press. But the good news is we defeated the Nazis at home and abroad, which led to post-war prosperity. Round 3 score, fascist oligarchs 0, we the people 3. Part 4. Round 4 is the 1980s Reagan era. We'll go more into this in Episode 2, an inconvenient sequel, but here's the highlights. After World War II, productivity and wages both go up together, partially because we're investing in ourselves. For example, the GI Bill for education, VA loans for buying homes, as well as investing in a lot of research and development. This was done by the government, but also by the corporations, because at this time there's a 90% tax bracket, So CEOs put money back into the business in terms of innovative research and development, but also wages. Not coincidentally, unions are also very strong in the post-war period, because in 1935, FDR had passed a law to protect them. So unions provide a kind of counterbalance to corporate power. But along with the prosperity came turmoil. The civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, gay liberation, American Indian movement, and Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers. Also during this period, there were the Vietnam protests, and corporations like Dow Chemical brought us horrendous weapons like Agent Orange and napalm. For the first time in a long time, maybe since the Progressive Era, what's good for General Motors is good for the USA was questioned. This paradigm shift terrifies one Lewis Powell, who was a corporate lawyer. His neighbor and pal was Eugene Sydnor, head of the Chamber of Commerce, now the biggest lobbyist in the United States, shoveling corporate secret money into our elections. Powell writes a secret memo for the Chamber to defend American corporations. His basic argument is the left has capabilities that the right lacks. So they need to leverage their resources, basically money, and build up what he claimed were balancing capabilities. For example, they're going to use their money to intimidate the press and the universities to send right-wing conservative messages about how great the free market is. The Powell memo is the blueprint for the right-wing infrastructure, better known now as the Coctopus, because it was immediately funded by some of America's greatest fortunes, including the Koch brothers, Richard Scaife, who was a Mellon, Joseph Coors, the DeVos family, and others. Those budgets paid for think tanks, AstroTurf front groups, and conservative media. We will see in the next episode that the fossil fuel corporations basically rented out this right-wing infrastructure in order to carry out their business model, which requires burning the planet for profit. Not only that, but it enables the systemic degradation that makes oligarchic coups possible, as we'll see. Nixon appoints Powell to the Supreme Court, where he steadily undermines campaign finance laws, which were put in place after the Watergate scandal exposed that Nixon was elected with the help of, you guessed it, secret corporate money. Powell and the Supreme Court start effectively overturning campaign finance law like the Tillman Act with the Bellotti and Buckley cases, which steadily gave corporations more ability to contribute to political campaigns, which in turn helps Ronald Reagan to win the White House. Powell's efforts eventually will lead to the 2010 Citizens United case, which unleashed the tsunami of dark money into our political system. Clearly, it's not an accident that weakening campaign finance laws are one of those 5 steps Tom Hartman has laid for a democracy to fall to fascism oligarchy. Step 1 is to get control of the media, academia, and we can add courts. Step 2 is weaken or evade campaign finance law. This makes it easier to accomplish Step 3, takeover of a political party. Then taking over the government is Step 4. Step 5 is to use the police or military to protect oligarchic power. See the study guide or bonus episodes for how these steps were used in rounds 4 through 6. Because we just went through the 5 steps from round 5, and we've just lived through them yet again, you can no doubt do the steps for round 6 yourself. Feel free to check your work and ours in the study guide or bonus episode. Instead, let's quickly go through a checklist to see where we are and learn how far the coup has gone. For a deeper understanding, let's have a look at Hungarian dictator Viktor Orban's playbook. How many of his 10 steps has Trump already accomplished? Step 1. Take over your party and enforce internal party discipline by using political threats and intimidation to stamp out all party dissent. Romney's Senate colleagues told him during the impeachment that they could not afford private security to protect their families as he did, so they could not vote for conviction. A mean tweet from Trump or even one from Musk, backed with the threat of his money for a primary challenger, is frightening enough to get votes for cutting school lunches, to pay for private jets, for absurdly unqualified cabinet heads and 19th century tariff policies that didn't even work then. Step 2. Build your base by appealing to fear and hate. Branding immigrants and cultural minorities as dangers to society and demonizing your opponents as enemies of the people. This has been Trump's game since coming down the golden escalator with unemployed actor extras. He moved from calling the press the enemy of the people to the more ominous enemy within at the end of the 2024 campaign. He even sics the Department of Justice on people from his own first-term administration, never mind accusing Obama of treason. Step 3. Use disinformation and lies to justify what you're doing. Washington Post fact-checkers documented more than 30,000 Trump lies in his first term, more than 20 a day. The lying differed not just in degree, but in kind from previous politicians, though his conscious use of repetition is very similar to Hitler's big lie technique. Some recent examples. Doge found virtually no waste, fraud, and abuse. Though it caused literally tons of food taxpayers have already paid for to rot in warehouses while children starved. They found no 150-year-old Social Security recipients. January 6th was not a day of love. China will not pay the tariffs, just as Mexico never paid for the wall. Beautiful, clean coal will not power a rebirth of American manufacturing, etc., etc. Misinformation flows freely on social media and state media, Fox. Again, see bonus episodes. Step 4. Use your election victory to claim a sweeping mandate, especially if you didn't win a majority. In 2020, Biden won by 7 million versus Trump's 2.3 million in 2024. Trump failed to secure a majority of the popular vote at 49.7%. A mere 0.15% of voters nationwide was the difference. Despite this, we get constant repetition of the mandate mantra, though almost nothing Trump has done is what he promised, aside from mass deportations and the tariffs that even most of his supporters did not think he would actually do. Polls prove his policies are not popular. The mantra is used for sleight of hand. Trump was elected, thus all his actions are the will of the people. Step 5. Centralize your power by destroying the civil service. Central to Project 2025's goal to dismantle the administrative state, Schedule F is a probably illegal plan to steadily replace long-time, competent federal workers with political appointees whose only qualification is loyalty to Trump. Instead, we got the Doge coup blitzkrieg, using armed agents to force workers out and prevent members of Congress with oversight responsibilities from seeing what actions and data are being taken. The blitzkrieg went further and faster than Project 2025's Schedule F ever dream. Musk boasted of putting our foreign aid, along with our soft power foreign policy, not to mention our humanitarian conscience, through the wood chipper in a weekend. Social Security offices, vital health research, it will take months, if not longer, just to assess the damage, and decades to recover, depending how soon the courts and we the people in the streets can stop them. Step 6. Redefine the rule of law as rule by executive decree. Weaponize the state against all democratic opponents. Demonize anyone who doesn't support the leader as an enemy of the people. The Doge Blitzkrieg is a lawless extension of executive power. Trump has issued nearly 160 executive orders and 40 memoranda, which are basically the same but allow him to skirt some legal requirements. 78 are presumably mindless knee-jerk reversals of Biden executive orders on climate and COVID relief. Some are just dumb and performative, like renaming the Gulf of Mexico. But pulling us out of the Paris Climate Agreement again and the World Health Organization will have cascading catastrophic effects for many years. Step 7. Eliminate checks and balances and separation of powers by taking over the legislature, the courts, the media, and civil society. Advise and consent. Threaten the legislature if they don't rubber stamp even the most incompetent, unqualified cabinet picks. For example, an alcoholic Fox weekend host who committed sexual assault and drove 2 small nonprofits into the ground. Grab the power of the purse by having Musk shut down programs or whole departments. Even tariffs were traditionally the power of Congress before Trump learned how to seize them by declaring emergencies. Ignore court orders. Federal judges and even the Supreme Court ordered the return of immigrants with soccer and autism tattoos sent without trial to a Central American gulag. Moreover, Trump sued law firms, media corporations, and universities into submission. Step 8. Rely on your oligarchs, hugely wealthy business leaders, to supervise the economy and reward them with special access to state resources, tax cuts, and subsidies, exactly like Vladimir Putin. Trump's second inauguration was a billionaire coronation. 13 of them have senior cabinet positions, many being major campaign donors. Scott Bessent, Treasury, and Howard Lutnick, Commerce, were hedge fund guys. Doug Burgum, Interior Department, will sell off our public lands to oil companies, and oil CEO Chris Wright, Energy, will boost subsidies for coal and oil and slash green energy competitors. EPA head Lee Zeldin will ensure they can pollute for free. But of course, the biggest billionaire and the biggest recipient of government goodies with the biggest impact on policy is Elon Musk. Musk spent over $250 million to elect Trump and even built his get-out-the-vote effort in the swing states. In return, Trump immediately fired 12 inspectors general, shutting down active investigations of Musk companies with current contracts worth $3 billion. In addition, the Trump administration kneecapped the SEC that fights monopolies and shut down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau so corporations can rip us off without fear. Step 9. Ally yourself with other authoritarians like Vladimir Putin and support his efforts to undermine democracy and attack sovereign countries like Ukraine. In Trump's first term, he exchanged love letters with North Korea dictator Kim Jong-un and constantly supported Putin. Trump and/or his top officials endorse autocratic politicians in Germany, Hungary, Poland, El Salvador, Brazil, Argentina, and many more. A president's first foreign trip is normally with our strongest and closest allies, like Canada and Mexico. But since he's currently extorting them with tariffs, he opted for 3 oil monarchies: Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Trump's sons did real estate and crypto deals. Presumably no one mentioned the American journalist the Saudi crown prince ordered murdered, who was cut up with a bone saw. Qatar gave Trump a free $400 million flying bribe palace that will only cost taxpayers $435 million to retrofit, which he gets to keep. Step 10. Get the public to believe that all this is necessary and that resistance is futile. So now you know how we got here and what is at stake, and that we've been here before and won every time. It all comes down to you, to us. It's unclear if in round 6 the oligarchs and fascists will finally win for the first time in 2.5 centuries. Despite the only real legislative accomplishment of the first and probably second Trump term being a massive tax cut for billionaires and corporations, McConnell did also manage to cram a lot of right-wing judges into our courts. Happily, Trump has routinely lost even before these hand-picked judges. However, it is becoming clear that while the courts can provide a holding action, it will be up to the American people in the streets making it clear we will not be ruled by kings or fascists. We must be persistent, resilient, and unrelenting. Talk to and work with your friends and neighbors. It almost does not matter on what. Planting a tree, cleaning up a creek or abandoned lot, delivering a meal to an elder. Action, especially with others, reduces the paralyzing fear or despair that fascism depends on. Show up for town halls and rallies. See indivisible.org. Call and write your representatives, even if they seem on board or hostile, or even if not responding. Every call gets counted. If they get a dozen calls in one day on a topic, it's guaranteed that will be reported to the Chief of Staff. But in addition to our current actions, we have to keep our eyes on the prize. In the next episode, we'll see deeper into the Powell memo, which led to the right-wing infrastructure, as well as the systemic degradation, like Citizens United, that made our current crisis possible. That in turn will provide the basis for what needs to be done to ensure it never happens again. A 28th Amendment that firmly and clearly enshrines once and for all that corporations are not people and money is not speech. Join us.
And there's a fear that's made to keep us in our place, to pacify our anger and justify our full disgrace. There's a field made to destroy and to degrade, but now we see shining light, oh, and we are not afraid. But when the people speak, it's not with corporate lies. It's not with indecision or academic woes and ties. When the people speak, it thunders through these hills. It's not a thing, it's mild and weak. When the people